From Iran to Palestine, oil prices to trade wars, Donald Trump's speech to the UN General Assembly advocated nationalism over globalism. Trump promotes a policy of America first, but does that also mean America alone? This is Inside Story. Hello everyone, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. We reject the ideology of globalism and accept the doctrine of patriotism. Perhaps not what you would expect from a world leader speaking on the premier global stage, the UN General Assembly. But then Donald Trump has never been one for convention. In a 34-minute speech, the US president made it clear America will look after itself, will only give aid to those it considers friends, and, in his words, will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance. Question is, what does that mean for everyone else? The world leaders who spoke from the same podium advocating alliances and a joint approach to our world's problems. That's our discussion today. We will welcome our panel in just a moment. But first, our diplomatic editor James Bays on the speech and the surprising reaction it drew.
When President Trump came to the United Nations, the first other world leader he met was his French counterpart. He and Emmanuel Macron embraced warmly. They're known to get on well, something that is perhaps remarkable when you realise, as became clear in their speeches, that they have very different visions of the way the world should be run. Trump's worldview is America first, with all the other countries also putting their own national interests first too. He laid that out in a speech that didn't get off to a good start when his bold claim was met with gasps of astonishment and then laughter.
In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Trump talked about a constellation of strong, sovereign, independent nations. It, of course, raises the question of whether the US will give up its moral leadership on issues like human rights.
That's why America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. I honor the right of every nation in this room to pursue its own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The United States will not tell you how to live or work or worship.
A couple of hours later, and the French president was at the same podium. He agreed the world faced crisis, but for very different reasons. Nationalism, he said, meant that international cooperation was breaking down.
There's no need to look too far to see who is to blame. They're here in this assembly. They're speaking today. Those responsible are us, the leaders of the world.
It was an impassioned speech. He said he didn't believe in the law of the strongest, and he made a passionate defense of parts of the system the Trump administration has either attacked or defunded.
We shall support those working for peace and humanity. UNESCO, the conscience of the United Nations, the Human Rights Council, the International Criminal Court, UNRWA, for whom we're increasing our support.
In his speech, President Trump said his administration will reassess how much money it gives to the UN and how much funds it gives in international aid. That potentially is setting up a new confrontation for next year. President Macron says he wants to give 40% more in international aid, and France is heading the G7 next year. It wants all the members, which include the US, to give more. James Bays, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations.
All right, so here's the panel for today. We're starting in Tehran with Foad. Izadi, he is a professor of world studies at the University of Tehran. In New Jersey is Stephen Rogers, a member of the Donald J. Trump for President Advisory Board, also an advisor to the 2016 Trump campaign. And rounding out the panel in London is Olivier Guitta. He is a security and political risk analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us for Inside Story. Stephen Rogers in New Jersey, I'm going to start with you. At the start of the show, I put forward this idea of, is it America first? And does that mean America alone? I would like your view on that, because whilst everything Donald Trump said was completely expected, most of the other leaders who got up to that podium said something different. And I wonder if that's going to end up isolating the United States.
Well, you're correct in saying that it was expected by the world leaders. The president has kept his promise to the American people that it would be America first, but it will not be America alone. The nations in our alliance know that they need us. They know that they need our protection when it comes to military, and they know they need our money. Look, the United States of America has paid heavy tolls around the world, economically and through blood, with regard to protecting countries in times of war. So the president is simply saying, as he said in his first UN speech many years ago, that the president of the United States is not the president of the world, he is the president of America.
Olivier, Guitta, let's bring you in early on. What do you think of what Stephen's saying there? He said basically these nations know that everyone needs the United States. But again, I go back to the point that the United States seems to be pulling back from all these other countries.
Look, there are a couple of things to note in terms of the speech and the direction is the fact that the president came about being responsible for the actions of the people. So what we've seen yesterday and also on his points on NATO are clear. Is a businessman. It comes to the bottom line. If an institution or a group is basically squandering the money of the US, he will stop funding it. It's playing to its base, and we've seen that time and again. But at the same time, he works on his own logic that America is not there to be not only the gendarme, if you will, of the world, but also the bankroller of failing institutions. So that is not at all a surprise. When it comes to the alliance, remember as well that he mentioned a kind of Arab NATO, and I think a lot of the commentators are not looking at that. So it is not fully against all alliances, and what he said about the original NATO is clear, that the US cannot bear all the financial weight, and that the other countries have to decide if they want to be part of an alliance, they need to up their defense budget. So all this comes in the light of the speech of yesterday, which shouldn't be a big surprise for the allies, but I don't think America will end up alone in this case.
Okay, interesting. And you've brought up funding. We're going to talk more about the funding issue a little bit later in the programme. For now, Foad, Izadi, I'm going to bring you in and start to get in on some of the specific issues. You are there in Iran. Was Donald Trump's... Well, actually, why don't we have a listen to Donald Trump first of all? This is what he actually had to say when speaking about Iran specifically at the General Assembly.
Iran's leaders sow chaos, death, and destruction. They do not respect their neighbors or borders or the sovereign rights of nations. Instead, Iran's leaders plunder the nation's resources to enrich themselves and to spread mayhem across the Middle East and far beyond.
Yeah, so that's what he said in his speech. And then this is what he actually tweeted not long before arriving at the General Assembly. Despite requests, I have no plans to meet the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. Maybe someday in the future. I'm sure he is an absolutely lovely man. Foad, Izadi, what do you make of all of that? Because I think in the build-up to the General Assembly speech, we were all thinking, wow, he's going to hit Iran really hard. My feeling personally, and I'd like to know what you think, is that he actually possibly held back a bit.
I think his UN speech was quite tough on Iran. The tweet was strange. As you said, people were expecting that he is going to be consistent, at least when it comes to his anti-Iranian rhetoric. But the tweet, the last sentence of that tweet was surprising. It reminded people of how he was talking about the North Korean leader, and then now he seems to be getting along with Mr. Kim. The sentence that you played, I think, can answer the main question of today's program. The proper answer, I think, to the question is that you see a lot of inconsistencies when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. For example, the U.S. government accuses Iran of not respecting borders, but they have been occupying Syria for the last number of years without any request from the Syrian government. And in fact, in sort of disagreement with the Syrian government has asked the U.S. to leave Syria and end its occupation. They talk about killing the people in neighboring countries, but they have been supporting Saudis in their devastating war against the Yemeni people in the last number of years. So when you look at that speech at the UN, you see a lot of inconsistencies. He talks about sovereignty, but then he criticizes OPEC countries for selling oil at the price that he doesn't like. Or he criticizes Iran, but he gets out of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is the nuclear agreement, without any reason. So I think the answer to your main question is the US has decided, consciously I think, to go it along when it comes to many foreign policy issues.
Stephen Rogers, let's get a reply from you, because what Foad says, I think there's some truth to it there. He's saying that, well, we know that the United States pulled out of the Iran deal for example, and all these other nations have decided to stay with it. And as Foad points out, the United States has been doing a lot of what it says Iran is doing now.
Well, the president's been very consistent with Iran. Look, I don't believe there's a person on the face of this earth, especially in the body of the UN, that would disagree with the fact that Iran exports terrorism. We know that. Iran is responsible for a lot of trouble around the world. Iran has not contributed anything to any peace process anywhere. And if you really take a look at this, and this is my view, I don't speak for the administration, and it is the view of many people, that Iran doesn't have to look at the United States as their threat. The threat to Iran is their own people. They're taken to the streets. They're very fed up to their necks with Iran spending more money on the exportation of trouble than on their own people. So with regard to Iran, he's been consistent. But I will tell you this, our allies, we've been allies forever. At the end of the day, the allies will come together with the United States and address these problems that we are facing around the world together.
Olivier, sit tight. I will come back to you in a moment, but I think we need a reply from Foad, because that was actually one thing I did wonder during Donald Trump's speech, where he talked about Iran, the country, and he said the people are upset, the people have had enough, they're ready almost to rise up, they're sick of being taken advantage of and their money being taken away. Are they?
There could be some people who are upset with the Rouhani administration. I'm sure there are a lot of people that are upset with the Trump administration. But that doesn't give permission to the Iranian government to try to overthrow the Trump administration. That doesn't give permission to the Iranian government to basically supply intelligence to terrorist organizations that are engaging in terrorism inside the United States. That doesn't give Iran permission to sanction the American people severely, at the same time that there is a rhetoric of supporting the Iranian people, the American people. So the general inconsistencies that we see in U.S. foreign policy could be studied well when you look at U.S.-Iran relations. The United States had a 1953 coup d'etat in Iran, and it seems they haven't learned anything in the last 60 or 70 years. They want to change the Iranian government, as John Kerry, the former Secretary of State, said just a few days ago. The plan that the US government has is to overthrow the Iranian government, and they are actually working very hard at it. If you look at the speech that Mr. Pompeo and John Bolton had at this organization called United Against Nuclear Iran in New York just a few hours ago, you could sense this progress in terms of making sure that, as they say, Iran does not see the 40th anniversary of Islamic Revolution. But I have some news for US government officials and also your guest in New Jersey, that the Iranian people have been resilient for the last 40 years. They have faced lots of difficulties and sanctioned heavily by the United States, but they have managed to continue to survive under all these pressures, and they will continue to survive. And just because U.S. is supporting the former Shah's son or MEK or some other terrorist organization, that doesn't mean that the Iranian people will fall for that type of rhetoric and that type of policy.
OK. Olivier, just before we move on from Iran, maybe you can just give me the other perspective, because as I pointed out, it is the US that pulled out of the JCPOA, the Iran deal. It is a number of other nations, a number of European nations who have decided to stay with it. And the EU itself even talks about finding ways around the sanctions to make sure that they can still keep doing business with it. I mean, does that put the US and its European allies on some sort of collision course over Iran, which can't really be fixed if they're just going to take these completely different views?
Look, I think a couple of things needs to be put in perspective. As I said earlier, look at Trump's speech last year where he hit hard on North Korea. Look at Trump's speech this year where North Korea was praised time and again. One interesting aspect is not only the tweet that you mentioned, but also the fact that they left the door open to meet the Iranians. I think there are a couple of things to remember in terms of how Trump viewed all those different files, and that comes from his campaign. He was clear on the Iran deal being the worst deal ever signed by the US, so he didn't take anyone by surprise in terms of his European allies that he would get out of the deal. What is extremely interesting is how much the corporate world in Europe has responded to that cancellation of the deal, which it hadn't back in 2007, 8, 9, where the sanctions were in place and many companies did not abide by the deal, especially oil companies. Today, what we're seeing is that even companies that do not have business in the US from Western Europe are pulling out of Iran, which means that they're extremely scared about the consequences that could happen. And I could put to both of the other guests two sides of the equation. What's happening today is that Trump, by pulling off the deal, is basically crippling the Iranian economy in a way that it hasn't been crippled. And the flow of investment has dried up extremely quickly. It will have an impact on the domestic side. And one way or another, it will possibly push for Iranians to rebel, because they were hoping that that deal would change their everyday life.
Right.
And it's not the case.
Gentlemen, time's moving on a lot quicker than I thought, actually, so I want to move on to another topic. And Olivier, you've already brought this up, and that was the North Korea issue and the difference between last year's speech by Donald Trump and this one. Have a look.
The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. I would like to thank Chairman Kim for his courage and for the steps he has taken, though much work remains to be done. The sanctions will stay in place until denuclearization occurs.
So, Stephen Rogers in New Jersey, we go from Rocket Man, Little Rocket Man, I think even, to Chairman Kim. It's an extraordinary change in 1 year, and you can give Donald Trump credit for actually moving things on. There has been the Singapore summit since then, but again, it's all a little bit unpredictable. There hasn't been that much movement since Singapore. We don't really know where it's going, and I wonder what you think about, well, what we should really be thinking about Donald Trump and North Korea.
Well, keep in mind that when President Trump used the term Rocket Man, he was criticized by leaders all over the world. But yet, President Trump knew how to speak to Chairman Kim. So he got Chairman Kim to come to speak with him. In other words, he got him to the table. And look what we got in return. We got our hostages back. We're getting our killed in action in Korea back. Kim is now talking to the South Korean president. There's been no ballistic missile tests. So we did receive a lot. And what the president is signaling to Chairman Kim, just stay the course, keep on thinking about your future. You keep your word, we'll keep ours. Remember, President Trump is not a politician. He is a businessman. And he would rather sit across a table negotiating agreements than rather ending up on a battlefield fighting for whatever issue is presently being discussed. So this is a model, and it's working very well.
So does that mean he will just leave aside all the other issues which other countries are concerned about malnutrition in North Korea, about human rights, about all sorts of issues which have not been raised?
Well, the United States, look, we probably give more money and more food and more clothing and do everything possible around the world for human rights and for the poor. I mean, there's no question about that. Even those who oppose us would have to admit that, because facts are facts. But the president has made it very clear that it's about time that every single country carry its weight. It does its fair share. That's what this is all about, fairness. And the president has been able, to some degree, to move the EU nations to start contributing more, for example, to the security of their own countries. And we're going to see that happen with the other issues that you just articulated.
And that is a good issue to bring up, funding, just as we come down to the end of this discussion, because Donald Trump also said the United States would not pay more than 25% of the UN peacekeeping budget. And he said they're working to shift more funding from assessed contributions to voluntary contributions. I think this is a good chance, and we'll start with you, Foad, to talk about, I guess, the future of the UN here, the idea of it being funded in a more voluntary way.
You know, actually, I don't mind saying that the United States historically has used its funding to influence the United Nations in a way that basically serves U.S. foreign policy goals. And as we have seen in the last few decades, at least, that U.S. foreign policy goals generally end up in projects like the Iraq War or other mischievous foreign policy objectives that the U.S. engages in. So having a more independent UN, a UN that is not fully influenced by the United States, is actually welcome news. Let me just make a point about the North Korean issue that has a lot of lessons for people in Iran, because people are saying already in Iran that that's the model that Iran should use, that the US government understands the language of force. And when the country's President Rouhani, wanted to make an agreement, make a deal, negotiate, it ended up with basically nothing, and the US just got off that deal. But the US is dealing with North Korea in a much better terms. That doesn't mean Iran wants to make a nuclear weapon. That's forbidden under Iranian law. But making sure that Iran can defend itself in front of US aggression is something that's becoming very popular in here.
Olivier, I'll leave the last word with you. As we're talking about funding, as we're talking about the United States stepping back, should the United Nations be worried about its future, about a more divided future, about a less funded future?
Look, I think that a lot of nations will have to come to the fore and replace the US. But as President Trump said, and as we all know, the UN is dysfunctional at this point and needs a lot of reform. And we've seen time and again over the decades, new Secretary Generals coming in saying that reform is going to be done. But unfortunately, we have yet to see major changes from inside, and they have to come from outside. So if Trump is the wake-up call that the UN needs, then it's going to be good for everyone at the end of the day.
Nice point to leave it on. That is where we're going to leave it. Foad Izadi in Tehran, Stephen Rogers in New Jersey, and Olivier Guitta in London. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Inside Story. Remember, you can keep up to date with us online anytime. Our website is at aljazeera.com. Go to the programs link. Inside Story is there. We've also got our Facebook page up and running, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. There's our Twitter handle as well. It is at AJ Inside Story. I'm at Kamahl AJE if you want to message me directly. From the whole Inside Story team, thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon.